Hello, and welcome to the World Built Environment Forum webinar series. I would like to take this opportunity to thank ASITE, our lead tech partner. Thank you to ASITE. My name is Ken Creighton, Director of Thought Leadership and Public Affairs at RICS. Today's webinar is entitled Achieving Net Zero, a Best Practice Guide for Cities. I'd like to introduce our panel today. First, we have Emma Ashcroft, Associate Director, Cities and Regions, the Carbon Trust. Welcome, Emma.
Thank you very much. Nice to be here.
Thank you. And next we have Langdon Morris, co-author of Net Zero City. Good morning, Langdon.
Hey, good morning. How are you?
And our third panelist is Steve Turner, Director, UK Cities Climate Investment Commission, Connected Places Catapult. Hello, Steve.
Hi, and good morning.
Thank you all for being here. In this webinar, we have registrations from over 41 countries and well over 200 people registered to attend. Thank you for being here. We welcome your active involvement. I want to request that you please ask questions, which I think will really add a lot to the hour ahead of us. You'll notice on your screen, there is an option to ask questions. When you ask them, I can see them, and I will do my best to bring them into the conversation. So please ask questions, and I'll do my best to remind you to do so. And so with that, let's get right into it. And Emma, I would like to come to you for the first question. Emma, how well are cities currently meeting the challenge of achieving net zero?
Thank you. Yeah, so we've seen a huge surge in the popularity of net zero emissions targets, with cities and local authorities of all levels lining up to declare their net zero aspirations. In the UK, for example, over 450 local authorities have declared a climate emergency, which represents more than 85% of the UK's population. And many cities have committed to becoming net zero by dates as early as 2030. We've seen there's been a lot of lobbying from campaign groups and political pressure that has led to climate emergency declarations and commitments to net zero, both for the owner states that local government controls, but also for that of the wider city or region that the local authority represents. And I think this is a really positive development, and it's raised the importance of tackling climate change within local authorities. We were concerned, for example, that local authorities might deprioritize action on climate change during the pandemic because of a lack of resources, both in terms of funding and people. And that's a trend that we saw in the global financial crisis in 2008. But actually that didn't happen. And I think if anything, action on climate change within the kind of local government sector has increased in the last 2 years. So I think that demonstrates that climate change is fast being seen as a key strategic objective for local authorities. However, we found that many of the cities that we've worked with haven't given much, if any, thought to how they're going to achieve the target before they've actually committed to it. And this has meant that when we've subsequently gotten involved to support in the development of strategies and action plans, this is the first time that local authority stakeholders actually get a sense of what it's going to take in terms of the scale and cost of action. And this effort is even more pronounced for those cities that have set targets to commit to moving towards net zero at a faster pace than that of the central government for the country that they're within. So for example, here in the UK, there's lots of cities that have set net zero by 2030 targets, which is 20 years ahead of the national 2050 target. And this inherently places a lot more pressure on the local authority to fund things themselves. And in several cases has raised a legitimate question over how realistic that target actually is and achieving that target is. Another thing that I would say is that unlike with other terms such as carbon neutral, there isn't a commonly agreed definition of what constitutes net zero emissions in the setting of a city or a region. And there are lots of examples of people interchanging terms such as net zero and carbon neutral, even though they technically mean different things and represent different levels of ambition. Net zero, the term net zero carries a kind of strong promise of action, embraces the need to halt global emissions, and it's seen by many as the kind of hallmark of climate leadership. But we like I say, we still don't have a kind of commonly agreed definition for a city context. So at the Carbon Trust, we've been using a working definition, which is aligned to the Science Based Target Initiative. And it has three components, basically. Firstly, that we'd be aligned to a 1.5 degree trajectory in terms of carbon reduction. We also define what emission sources should be covered within that target. And we align with the GPC, which is a global protocol for how to assess emissions for a city or a region. So we align to what's known as the Basic Plus level of that standard in terms of the scope of emissions that are captured within the target. And then we also kind of set requirements around any remaining hard to decarbonize emissions, and that they would be there'd be a limit on how much can be offset, and they can only be offset through greenhouse gas removals rather than emissions avoidance, for example. And so this kind of, I think, this working definition that we use makes sure that the action plans that are developed are genuinely ambitious and represent a kind of leading edge in terms of achieving net zero and the scope of what's being addressed. Lastly, I would just say that the delivery, I think, varies hugely. So many cities have set targets but haven't yet clearly defined how to achieve them. And I think we're very much moving towards a stage of getting, there may be action plans that have been published, but it's getting into delivery now and developing much more detailed delivery plans which identify for each action, you know, exactly how they're going to be delivered, how will they be funded, who will be involved, and starting to actually initiate those commitments. And yeah, so I think we're very much into the kind of decade of action, as has been, as the UN would say, and a need to kind of really move towards action and away from the kind of commitments. So I think, yeah, in summary, I think really positive progress has been made, particularly in the last couple of years, but we've still got a long way to go. And yeah, there's a lot of action that's needed in the next few years to kind of cement this into actual reality.
Thanks, Emma. That's I guess a brilliant start to this discussion. And why don't we move to the second question to Langdon, which dives into this a bit. Langdon, cities are a complex mix of governance, infrastructure, real estate, business, consumers, etc. How can strategies to achieve net zero successfully incorporate all of these different elements?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think reflecting on sort of what Emma was just talking about, there's a huge amount of aspirational thought going on, and the transition from aspiration to implementation is often quite challenging. What we've thought about and what we've been working on is coming up with a couple of frameworks that would actually help cities and businesses to think about this in a systematic manner. And there are two in particular that I think are relevant to mention here. Number one is a framework that helps us think about actually what is the system of the city, because you know cities are one of the most complex systems that humans have ever devised, if not the most complex. And so if we're talking about changing the behavior of the city in a fundamental way, we have to understand the constituent elements of those systems and then see how we can leverage change within each of those elements, as well as leveraging change across the scope of the whole system. So in our work, we've broken it down into 7 different elements, and we've developed a roadmap that shows how actions in each of those 7 elements can be integrated together, so we have a comprehensive plan across a city or a city region. Just briefly, the elements are governance itself, which is what you mentioned in the question. So the process of leadership and governance in a city is a critical factor, obviously, in terms of organizing all the work that has to be done, as Emma was implying. The second element from our perspective is actually urban design and master planning itself. So, what is the physical construction of the city? What are the buildings? How are the buildings built? How is the city configured? We know that urban design has a huge impact on human behavior and on the behaviors which either enable or prevent us from achieving net zero or carbon neutrality. Third element is one of the key elements of infrastructure. In our framework, there are actually three infrastructure elements. One is an understanding of how food, water, and energy interrelate as a system. This is a relatively new area of scientific thought, which is often referred to as the FEW nexus. Second element of infrastructure is, of course, the transportation infrastructure of the city and its energy systems. And there's a real key issue here around scale. So, we can think about what I as an individual or what my family or what my company can do. But when we talk about the energy infrastructure of a city, we're talking about something which is at a much larger scale. So we have to really have the capacity to think at that scale and to act at that scale. And that's where sometimes the sort of the canyon between aspiration and action traps us, because energy systems are such large scale. Just as an example, it's been estimated by Vaclav Smil, who is an energy scientist, that the fossil fuel infrastructure in North America, which was developed over 120 or so years, costs about $100 trillion. So if we can think about, we have to replace $100 trillion of infrastructure based on fossil fuels, and it's therefore logically possibly going to cost us $100 trillion to fund an energy infrastructure which is not based on fossil fuels at a national level. We clearly have a scale problem, and we're going to have to address that. The third element of our infrastructure framework is the data and the analytics that underlie all of the policy initiatives that we might choose to develop. So currently the data possibly exist, but they're all held in different and incompatible databases. And therefore it's really difficult for policymakers to get a handle on really what's going on and what actions would provide the most benefit for the least cost in order to get us to net zero. So we think that creating a data and analytics platform across a city or region is a critically important factor. As you can see, this is a complex system we're talking about. So there's a lot that we have to consider, and that in some sense is fascinating, in some sense it's a bit intimidating. The next element of the framework is the notion that we want to shift to a circular economy. So we're looking in particular at where we get our resources from and how we manage our waste and how we eliminate waste. And the last element of the framework is the notion that all of this is going to require a massive amount of innovation. And many private sector companies are very good at innovation, but we're talking about innovation at a much larger scale, innovation at the scale of the entire city or the city region. And so we need to learn how to create and manage innovation at that scale. So if you think about these 7 elements and think about how actions in each of those areas need to be integrated together, then again, you get a sense of the complexity, but you also have, once you have a framework like this, you have the ability to say, well, okay, so what do we actually need to do here? And you can design and prioritize and begin to put into place the foundations that enable the policy changes that enable the changes in our behaviors. So that's my short answer to a very complex question.
Thanks, Langdon. That's brilliant. And before we get to our third question, we did have a question pop up from the audience while you were speaking from Martina. Thank you, Martina. And I'll take this moment to ask others in our large audience to please feel free to ask questions. Langdon, Martina asked, which city would you consider best in class as to their approach to getting to net zero? Do you have an answer for Martina?
Well, it's a funny question. I mean, it's a great question. I guess the answer is a little bit funny, and possibly a little bit unexpected. And I'll be very interested in Emma and Steve's opinions about this as well. The underlying issue in the current environment is how fast can cities take action? And I think that's what Emma was addressing. And what we observe is that around the world, cities which are democratic, which are democracies, are really struggling with this because they have to align so many different stakeholders, and democracies tend to evolve rather slowly. On the other hand, cities which are much more hierarchical, if the city leadership, as in, who's ever the boss, says this is what we're going to do, then it can happen quite quickly. So of all the cities in the world, the one that I might mention as an exemplar would be Dubai in the UAE, simply because the emir has said, we're going to do this. And so the entire city government is oriented towards figuring out what has to be done to actually do it.
Yeah, it's a great point. I wonder if any of our other panelists have a comment about that.
Yeah, it's an interesting point for sure. I think definitely one of the issues with working with local government in democratic societies is things can take time, and you have to, get a lot of people on board with things, and this can lead to delays, and we haven't got the luxury of time when it comes to addressing climate change. So I can see how examples where that isn't so much of a constraint can be positive in terms of delivering change more quickly. However, I do think that it is really important to kind of to bring people on board, and I think the message of urgency is a lot more understood and accepted now compared to even just a few years ago. So I think that's helping to kind of speed up progress and maybe avoid some of the red tape and typical bureaucracy that can slow progress down within the local government sector. A personal example, I haven't worked with every city in the world, so I'm probably biased, but I have worked with the City of London and with both the kind of Greater London Authority level and with the City of London, so within the square mile itself. And I think both authorities are doing really great work at developing plans which are really considered in terms of tailoring them to the local context, and thinking about how to integrate this into all areas of operations for the local government. So tying it into contracts and procurement, etc., which I think is very positive, and into policies that they set around development. And I think one thing I would mention as well, which I found particularly leading edge, was some work that City of London did looking at the impact of their investments, their financial investments. They have a very large investment portfolio, and so they're not just thinking about action they can take directly across their own estate and within their local area, but they're thinking about the broader impact they have across their supply chain. And financial investments is a really key area that they can think about responsible investment strategies to help to deliver carbon reduction globally. So I think, that for me is a really innovative and leading edge kind of approach, which I think more and more cities are starting to address.
Thanks, Emma. And I guess in some ways that's kind of a plug. I mean, Langdon makes a good point about the type of government, and you made an interesting plug about sort of a democracy there in a sense. And I know Martina had some follow-up questions about that point, which Martina, we might get to if we have time. Thank you. But for now, I want to turn to Steve. Let's get into the money side of this. Steve, how can cities best finance the transition to net zero?
Well, thank you very much, Ken. Very interesting discussion already, isn't it? I mean, I think, well, you can't do any of this without money. We can have as many strategies, as many toolkits, as many plans in the world, and there are some really good ones out there, but all of it's a bit irrelevant if you can't raise the finance. I think it's quite interesting because in and around COP26, which we at the UK CCIC were heavily involved in, a number of people commented on it being the finance summit. The work that we were doing in and around COP, we were getting an awful lot of interest in conversations in the margins and at events from the financial community and actually wanting to make investments. And there's a number of initiatives emerged out of COP26 that have been led by financial institutions rather than national government, which I think is a step in the right direction. We at the UK CCIC have brought together the UK's 12 largest cities. And we've been working with industry as well as financial institutions to convening those three entities really around the ability to secure finance. We did a piece of work last year, which we launched just before COP, which identified across those 12 cities an investment opportunity or cost, depending on your perspective, of 208 billion. So that's, you know, an eye-watering figure, and clearly way beyond the ability of the public purse to fund. And I'm guessing that's not just the case clearly just in the UK, that's a global issue. But I want to focus really on the difference between what we call, if you like, development finance and project finance. The project finance is the finance to actually fund capital projects. Development finance is the ability to bring projects to market for investment. We've known really for a considerable amount of time, decades actually, that there is enough finance to fund the projects. From the various funds, green bonds, investment funds, etc., all being set up almost on a weekly basis. We hear of a new green fund being established, but that's not the issue here actually. It's the issue of an ability of cities to bring projects forward for investment, that development finance, and that's very risky. The ability to identify the right projects, undertake the right, if you like, technical work on an engineering capability, and also undertake the right technical work in terms of packaging up so it's a financially suitable proposition with risks mitigated, revenues generated, etc., etc. And that's way beyond, frankly, the capacity of many local authorities to do. And it costs an awful lot of money to do, and people aren't willing to do that. So we've been trying to work with the 12 largest cities to aggregate that sort of demand and aggregate that capability to provide, if you like, a national framework in the UK for doing that. And it's interesting when you talk to entities like C40, we've been working very closely with this. They've not seen any actually other nation actually bringing where 12 of the largest cities have come together collectively to work together to secure that development finance work. And of course, looking at that from a financial institution perspective, they're very interested in it because they can then have one conversation with 12 cities as opposed to 12 individual conversations, and equally arguing for investors and of course national government. So it's a win-win in that regard. So we've been working with the Green Finance Institute. Emma's mentioned about in the City of London Corporation, the great facility they've got. We're working at UK Infrastructure Bank, C40, all the major banks, and critically pension funds and investment funds around that. So I think what we're seeing really now is an appetite and a recognition that the finance discussion is not about project finance. It's actually about the development finance issue and the ability for cities and arguably local authorities, not just cities, to bring projects forward for investment. And that's where the real critical financial challenge is and needs to be addressed.
Thank you, Steve. Any comment on that, Langdon or Emma?
Yeah, I have a couple of comments, if I may.
Please.
So I wanted to go back to the conversation about London and just what Emma had mentioned, and mentioned that the leadership of London is both very strong in terms of its legislative authority and very proactive in terms of the personality of Sadiq Khan and what he's trying to achieve. So I think that's the importance of leadership cannot be underestimated in this. In terms of what Steve was talking about, I think it's fascinating because I think really what he's referring to is the notion of innovation at scale as a function of development finance, which is a beautiful marriage. And an example that I thought of as he was talking that I wanted to mention is there's a principle that listeners may be aware of, which is district heating and district cooling, which is instead of trying to heat and cool individual buildings, setting up district heating and cooling plants, which provide heating or cooling depending on the climate to the buildings in the district, which is much more efficient. So it's a good strategy. But the problem with district cooling as it's been implemented is that if it's not set up right from a financing perspective and there's not an appropriate ability for the district cooling agency to make profit and to provide its services at, or its services at profit, then it doesn't work. It doesn't work well, and it's not adopted sufficiently. So the role of finance in making arrangements like that, deals like that, projects like that effective, I think is critical. The last thing I wanted to mention is on a global basis, there are billions, if not trillions of dollars of money chasing deals. There's no shortage of capital in the world. What there is a shortage of is development deals that capital wants to go towards. So I guess I'm just reinforcing everything that Steve said as being really, really important and a critical source of leverage.
Thank you. Great points. In carrying on the theme, if we can come to you, Emma, with our fourth question, is there a wealth divide between cities in tackling net zero? If so, what can be done to help less affluent cities?
Yeah, thank you. A very interesting question. My view is that, yeah, there definitely is a divide. And I think this is evident when you look at the difference between cities within the same country as well as between different countries. So, for example, within a country, there'll be different levels of local government, different tiers. And we've definitely seen a different level, different capacity to act depending on the size of the local government organisation. So there tends to be a higher capacity to act within larger mayoral combined authorities or city authorities and counties when compared to boroughs or districts or etc. So, but also between different countries, obviously developing countries don't have the same amount of funding, same amount of economic kind of strength to, and support from central government being flowed down to kind of local government. And cities in developing countries are often much more reliant on development aid to support city action. But this isn't always perfect and doesn't always provide the long-term certainty and legacy that's needed to kind of really implement change over the long term. So, and I think it can be affected by multiple things. So, firstly, the level of resource that the local government has to address this. So, do they have a dedicated climate change sustainability team with a ring-fenced budget to address this, or is it the case that it's an individual who wears multiple hats and climate change is part of a broader role? So that, you know, and that does happen in many cases, and so local government often just don't have sufficient resource in terms of people to address this issue. And I think it's also affected by the amount of funding that the local government has access to. So some will be able to access greater funding, both in terms of development and capital funding, through, for example, devolution deals where there's devolved funding and powers that enable them to kind of play a much more active role in addressing this, whereas other local governments just don't have that same access to funding and powers to enable them to kind of play that role. It also can be affected by even just the resource available to even bid for the funding that's available, whether that's through central government or international or other sources from the private sector. So, you know, just even if there is lots of funds available, it doesn't necessarily mean that all local governments have the same ability to access that funding. It will be very much affected by the people that they have available, the expertise and the kind of resource availability that they have. And I think each city is different. It will have different priorities. It will face different challenges, and the net zero strategy and action plan need to consider this specific context and design tailored solutions to address them. I would also say that achieving net zero is intrinsically linked to tackling economic and social issues. And many of the actions taken to address climate change can be designed in a way that it delivers co-benefits to address issues that are important to the local area. So that could be fuel poverty, economic growth, job creation, improving public health, air quality improvement, etc. And these co-benefits can be measured as part of a net zero action plan and can be used to generate more political support, but also funding support, and help to convince powers that be that there is around dedicating resource to this issue. in terms of the what can be done to help those cities that are less affluent, I would just completely echo what Steve has been saying. I think it's not just about capital funding. Actually, the bigger issue is much more around development finance, funding that helps to establish, develop pipelines of projects. So look at the feasibility of different options and help to determine, develop business cases for investment in different types of projects. I think that's where there is a gap. And not just in terms of developing pipelines and projects, but also funding to set up resources, set up teams of people that can work on this issue within local government. But as often that's a gap as well.
Thank you, Emma. Great points. And why don't we turn now to our fifth question, which is for Langdon, and it really touches on a point that was made before about people. And the question is, how significant a change in consumer behavior is needed for cities to become net zero? And Langdon, if you allow me, I'm going to add some topspin to this. Our prolific questioner, Martina, made some similar points along with your previous response, which touched on this. And she said, of the 7 elements of Langdon mentioned, is talking people / inhabitants. And I think she means, is that not absolutely critical? City officials need to be reelected by the citizens of cities. And then she went on to say, and I think this was touched on, but she said, well, if Dubai is best in class, does that mean democracy doesn't work? So I'm going to throw all of that on the table for you, Langdon. Let's talk about consumer behavior.
Yeah, that's good. Well, we have 3 more hours, so we're fine, right? Yeah, so democracy works really well for some things. It doesn't work very well for other things. And so that's part of our challenge. I mean, you know, scientists have been telling us for more than 30 years that this is a serious problem. And we're finally getting around to thinking about maybe we're going to do something about it. And that's very largely a function of how democracies work. They change relatively slowly unless there's a perception of enormous crisis. And so the climate emergency is building that perception, and we're seeing, as Emma said, more and more engagement by cities in the aspirational level, but we're still seeing a pretty significant gap in the action level. So democracies are not designed to change rapidly. In fact, they're designed to change slowly. So that's, you know, that's a challenge that we have to cope with. I don't want to turn this into a political philosophy conversation, so I'm going to shift and talk a little bit about the issue around consumer behavior, which I think is really a dual-edged sword, and it's a very interesting thing. And I'd actually be really interested to hear what Steve has to say about this as well. Because on the one hand, the answer is absolutely yes, consumer behavior change is going to be needed. And in fact, in the Net Zero book, in addition to the 7-step framework that I mentioned before, we also describe what it is that's necessary in order to make social change, because we're talking about social change in terms of behavior at the level of the economy. So we're talking about shifting to a circular economy. We're also talking about changing our behaviors largely with respect to how we consume and how we produce and consume energy. But it's problematic for consumers in the sense that, you know, we as individuals, as families, even as businesses may wish to change our behaviors in order to have an impact. But if we're working in a macro system that is not oriented to net zero, then, you know, we could make a 0.5% change, and the bigger system is doing the same thing at 99.5% not change. And so, you know, it sort of becomes insignificant. It's like the question of, you know, if I have a car and my car produces greenhouse gas emissions as well as other pollutants, then that's a problem for the world. But if there's only one car in the world, then it really doesn't matter. The issue is that there are billions of cars. So we have a scale problem. You know, we have the individual scale at one hand and we have the macro scale at the other hand. And so this, in my mind, goes back to what Steve was talking about, which is we have to think about how we're going to achieve change at a much, much larger scale. And that's beyond what any individual consumer can do other than as an advocate for change in their community. And so then it goes back to leadership, and it goes back to aggregating capital at a very large scale across as he mentioned, for example, 12 cities in a nation, which would represent a significant proportion of the nation's population, the 12 largest cities. That's really where the action has to take place in terms of achieving net zero targets. Now, individual consumers may be most effective as advocates, and they may be most effective as voices that are willing to say, yes, I'm willing to change my behavior in the context of a larger macro change. But I can recycle my trash, I can drive less, I can take public transit. All those things are significant and important, but they're not going to achieve the change at the level of scale that is necessary. So in my mind, the change has to go back to leadership and the macro systems, the large scale energy systems that are powering civilization. This is where the real change is necessary. And to the point about democracy, where it's hard to get people aligned. And I can give a specific example of that. We look sort of sadly at the US government and particularly the US Congress as an agent of change right now. And we're in this very, very sad situation where we have one US senator who happens to be an owner of coal mines, and he's able to hold up political change legislation to embrace, the climate emergency in the US simply because he has personally a conflict of interest. And our political system is so polarized right now and so evenly balanced in a strange way that one senator is effectively able to block an agenda which is critical not just for the US but for human civilization. So we have a challenging situation, and we're going to have to overcome those types of resistance in order to achieve the goals that we're all sharing around net zero.
Well, that's a very sobering and real point. Thank you for that, Langdon.
Could I just jump in on this as well, if that's okay? Thank you. I just wanted to agree with what you're saying, Langdon, but also just raise the point that to illustrate this, in the UK, the Committee for Climate Change, who set their carbon budgets, estimated recently that over half of the emissions reduction needed to achieve our sixth carbon budget, which is between 2033 and 37, involves people making low carbon decisions. So that could be ranging from technologies that they use, the consumption patterns for heating and mobility, or even through to dietary choices. So I think it's really, and I think local authorities are really closely connected with their local communities in a way that central governments just aren't. So I really think it's very important that they're empowered to deliver and play a role in delivering kind of long-term engagement programs with their citizens. So it could be through engagement campaigns, cross-sector partnerships, even citizens' assemblies, which are happening increasingly on this issue. But I think, we're not going to achieve net zero without significant change in consumer behaviour. And I think local government are a trusted organisation that are closely connected through lots of community groups with their citizens. So they, I think, have a really key role to play in helping to achieve that change in behaviour.
I absolutely endorse that point that Emma's just made there about the critical role that local authorities play wherever they are. They are delivering services at a local level. They know their communities. They know what works best for those communities, and they understand them better. The other point I would add is that communities at whatever scale or level need to see material benefit or impact of adopting a net zero lifestyle. And I think that's up until now, it's not been as clear and as transparent to them as perhaps it needs to be. So we do need to work harder, I think, around that consumer behaviour. We can't expect people to change their behaviour. It's going to cost them more. We just simply can't. It's got to have a real demonstrable impact and benefit to them into their lives and livelihoods. And we do need to work hard at that. We're in a major global crisis at the minute, and one of the fallouts of that is escalating costs in fuel, which does potentially present a window of opportunity in terms of that net zero transition if national government work closely with their local authority partners in terms of what may need to be achieved in terms of that shift away from a fossil fuel reliance towards renewables.
Thanks, Steve. And it sounds like you just made the next question more difficult for yourself. I'm going to ask this to you, but it feels like this is the one. If you haven't started taking notes yet, here, this is the answer you want to hear. So given all that, Steve, how can cities develop an effective net zero technology strategy?
Well, I think doing I think any technology strategy on its own is not going to work, is it? I think that's the first point I'd make. It's got to be aligned to governance. It's got to be aligned to working with partners. And we know that, across most cities, certainly in the Western world, the assets, the infrastructure, the buildings are all owned and operated by different entities. So a technology strategy on its own isn't going to work. It's got to be aligned to what those partners, be they public or private organisations, are doing and constraints that they operate under. It's also critically got to be aligned to a finance strategy as well, and arguably carbon budgeting, of course, as well. So on its own, it won't work. That said, in terms of identifying the technology, I don't think I think we're beyond the technology fix point now. We need a financial fix, I'd argue. We're talking with the chief executive of Siemens UK and Ireland recently. He was saying 80% of the technologies are already there in the marketplace and available to achieve net zero. And that's in two regards, really. I think if we think about the energy supply side, that's clearly a shift away from fossil fuels to renewable technologies, and they're there and they're available. Admittedly, they become more efficient and etc. and more cost effective, but they're there. And then you also have that transition that's required, if you like, on the demand side, and technologies required around commercial building retrofit, residential retrofit, EV infrastructure and charging, etc. etc. I think the other point to make is some of these technologies are a lot easier to invest in than others. So we take them, again, the work we did in our phase 1 report, which looked at 6 different assets, one of those being renewables. And it is a much more attractive proposition for an investor to invest in, a solar farm or a wind farm than it is in retrofit in a neighbourhood. So that, we need to think about that, and they will cherry pick, and understandably so, the more investable technologies, which leaves you in a city, in a local area, with some more challenging technologies to actually invest. So thinking this through, you therefore need to think around what we've been doing is a blended finance model where you can take some of the revenues generated from renewables and use those to cross-finance and subsidise some of the more challenging assets, to say, around residential retrofit, which again emphasised my point that a technology strategy on its own will not work. It needs to work with other elements. I've mentioned the critical bit. I think the role again that local authorities play here as conveners. We talked around the infrastructure assets, supply, demand, buildings. It needs to be a partnership approach, particularly in Western local authorities and cities. Slightly different, in some other nations and other economies where there's more of a top-down approach and easier to achieve in that regard. So, I think what we're saying here really is there's a critical role for cities and local authorities to play in curating this, but needing to work with their both public and private sector partners to achieve that. The other thing I'd say, the work we've been doing as well, is we're working with the 12 cities in the UK. We're starting to develop what we're calling a UK national project pipeline. We'll get a better word for it, don't worry. But that is essentially is looking at all the different projects that those authorities are looking to invest in and aggregating them. So we can actually start to, if you like, do it in 2 ways. One, a local authority can say we've got 12 projects and we need to do X amount of work on these to bring them for investment. Or you could actually aggregate across the 12 cities all of those that are looking at, for example, EV infrastructure charging, and aggregating that demand, which makes it much more attractive for investors to want to invest in across, as I say, 12 cities, which is a damn sight lot easier for them than doing it individually. So, you know, final point really is that a technology strategy will not achieve net zero on its own. It needs to be aligned to other work around finance, around governance, and critically, of course, around delivery.
Thanks, Steve. Thank you. Emma, let's turn to measurement. And this is my second to last planned question. And again, to the audience, don't leave Martina on her own. Please feel free to ask questions if you'd like. I'll do my best to get them in. But Emma, how can cities measure their net zero progress?
Yeah, thank you. So I think really it starts with a baseline, a footprint, which you know, which measures the emissions, and it depends on what the scope of the net zero target is. Does it just look at the own estate of the local government? But are you also setting a target for the wider city? Usually it's both, so you might have two baselines essentially, one for your own estate, one for that of the wider city or region. And so, yeah, you need to start with that and then regularly track the emissions against your net zero aligned carbon budgets. And so this might involve annual updates, reviewing what's happened with emissions, and seeing what the progress looks like against a pathway. So we'd usually compare that to a target pathway, which looks at the annual reduction required to be in line with 1.5 degrees and a net zero outcome in the end. So yeah, we'd be looking to kind of implement processes whereby that data is captured and updated annually, and progress is tracked and measured in that way. So that's the first thing I would say. I think the other thing, the wider part of measuring progress would involve developing a monitoring and evaluation plan of some sort, which devises KPIs and that reflect the aims and the commitments that have been set out within the strategy and action plan. And this is likely to be a mixture of qualitative and quantitative KPIs, which also capture maybe the wider co-benefits that the organisation is looking to achieve through the implementation of a net zero plan. So thinking about the kind of ways in which we might judge whether that has been a success, and that might be at the whole plan level in terms of general outcomes that you've seen, but also linked and tied to the individual actions that are part of the plan, so that there will be specific commitments to do certain projects, whether they be focused on housing or transport, energy generation, or energy systems type projects. And yeah, you may set specific kind of KPIs or goals within each of those themes. And I think that also ties to the kind of role of governance. For me, once you've published an action plan or a strategy, it's really important that you've considered the kind of role of governance in overseeing the implementation of that plan going forward. And I think for plans that capture emissions across an entire city, it's very important that that governance has cross-sector representation with the public, private and third sectors within that local area. And I think identifying kind of key champions and setting up working groups or steering groups that are focused on different themes within the plan, that each have their own KPIs that they're working towards, and can judge the success across the different themes that climate change cuts across. I think that's really important to kind of make sure that there is a constant focus on the kind of progress that's being made and how effective it is, and yeah, it's always looking back to what was originally kind of committed to in the strategy or the plan. I think there are some examples already actually of kind of independent evaluation as well of net zero kind of progress across cities. So to give an example, in the UK we have an organisation called Climate Emergency UK who've played a key role in kind of lobbying local governments to set net zero targets, and they've now developed a scorecard which compares the strength of all of the different climate action plans across the UK, and that essentially ranks them, which I think, and have devised a kind of methodology to kind of assess the strength of each action plan. So I think it's really important in whatever form for there to be some independent challenge of what's happening and how effective it is. And local government might even choose to set that up through independent kind of commissions and boards that maybe provide a kind of arm's length kind of assessment of the progress and that's being made. It's also, I guess, important to mention a range of standards and initiatives that exist that you may want to align to in order to kind of show that you are demonstrating best practice and how you're going about tackling this issue. And there are so many, so I won't be able to name them all, but just a few that I think are really key in the context of city action would be standards surrounding carbon footprinting for cities. So I mentioned previously the GPC, it's the GHG protocol standard for footprinting for cities. There's also PAS 2070, which also thinks about supply chain, not just emissions within the city itself. There's also standards and initiatives around target setting. So the Science-Based Target Initiative would be a really key one. And then thinking about, different aspects of action. So for example, buildings, BREEAM and other kind of standards for what a kind of best practice looks like when it comes to a low carbon or a net zero building. There's also the Fast Infra Sustainable Infrastructure label. This is something we've been getting involved in quite a bit recently. There are also standards around and frameworks around emissions reporting and disclosure through platforms such as CDP and the Global Covenant of Mayors. And then lastly, kind of focused on things like measurement and verification. So if you implement a project that's designed to achieve a certain amount of carbon reduction, how are you making sure that it's actually achieved those outcomes? So making sure that there's a plan in place aligned to a standard like CMVP, for example, that kind of sets out kind of what the project's aiming to achieve and tracks whether it's actually achieved that. And I think RICS as well have been involved in other efforts to kind of start to bring some of this together to provide a kind of common reporting framework and standardization of how we kind of address this. So yeah, I'm not sure, Ken, if you've got anything to add to what I've already shared.
Yes, thank you. ICMS, it's cost and carbon management standards, is one. It's a coalition actually of 50 organizations from around the world, not just RICS, but we're one of 50. And it is all about bringing consistency to how, in this case, carbon is reported when it comes to the whole life cycle of anything you can build, infrastructure in the widest possible definition. And I think as part of this, we do have a challenge when it comes to data and consistency, where all the standards out there, let's just assume that they're all of quality and they're great. That's not the problem. The problem is that they're all different, right? And so, the apples and bananas are both great pieces of fruit, but they're not the same thing. And so we do have an issue, I think, with consistency and even hedging between standards to maybe look more net zero than in a project than another standard might make it look. And that does lead to potential inconsistency and confusion. And I think we all understand that releasing carbon is not something that's subjective. It can't be negotiated. And so how we measure it, however we measure it, needs to be consistent. I think that also relates to a challenge we have just in access to data, and not just a consistent format for data, but how we actually get access to it in a comparative way. And that's also something that at RICS we've been working on. Well, let's turn to the last question. It's for all of you. We're 6 minutes to the hour, and I would like to leave a few minutes to wrap up. So relatively quickly, I want to ask about cities that are leading the way towards net zero and what other cities can learn from them. We've mentioned Dubai, we've mentioned London, and I wonder if our panelists have some others. why don't we start with you, Steve?
Yeah, happy to kick that off. I think it's, and I'm not trying to dodge this, but it's not straightforward, is it? You know, we all like a poster child city, don't we, to look at and mimic and emulate. I think achieving net zero, however, is combined, as we've heard today, made up of a number of different facets. The ability to create strong and effective governance structures, the ability to secure finance, the ability to work in partnership with the public and private sector, the ability to harness strong community engagement and resultant behaviour, and the ability to innovate. You know, and if you looked at cities, they'll all be scoring slightly differently on all of those different facets. You know, around governance, well, that's a bit like comparing apples and pears, isn't it? You know, frankly. Finance, we've done some great work coming out of Toronto. Partnerships, there's some brilliant work in Amsterdam. Community engagement, some really good stuff in UK cities around some of that. So, you know, it's a bit difficult. The one, however, I would pick that I think is very interesting is Oslo. Oslo, one of the first cities to pilot and run successfully carbon budgeting. By that, I mean they've been very clear in understanding what they need to do to achieve net zero, what technologies they need to deploy. They've actually allocated specific budgets across the city and with their partners, both public and private, to achieving that. So it's actually started to mainstream their budgets to a net zero strategy. So for me, if I'm going to pick one, which I know you're going to ask me to do so, Ken, it would be Oslo at the minute.
Thank you. And they've heard you in Oslo. Langdon?
Yeah, I love Steve's answer and the fact that he mentioned that there are 5 different factors that come into play, which I think is really an important part of the story. I'm actually going to suggest not a city, but a country, which is another of the Scandinavians, which is Denmark. The nation of Denmark has really embraced the significance and importance of net zero and climate change, and has made initiatives across the entire country, and furthermore sees itself as having a responsibility globally. And so its climate actions and climate advocacy and sharing of best practices that have been developed in Denmark and elsewhere is really a global effort that's a significant part of its diplomacy. So I think we can look at Denmark as a really strong example of a nation which is committed not only in its own geography, which is of course pretty small, but as an advisor, as a source of expertise and a source of financing as well for many other cities and nations around the world.
Go Denmark. Emma?
Yeah, so I mean, I've mentioned obviously London already earlier in the talk, but one thing I would like to highlight is more generally is energy accelerator programs. We've been involved in quite a few, so the one specifically in Leeds and in London, and all of them, the ones in the UK, have mostly been funded through European funding, and I think there are a lot of similar programs across the European Union and member states of the European Union. So the way these are designed are basically programs that maybe are often run by a mayoral combined authority, but they provide support to all levels of local government within that larger region to help them develop a pipeline of projects and bring them to financial close. And the ones that we've been involved in have been focused on delivering projects like district heating, district cooling, retrofit to buildings in terms of energy efficiency, looking at energy generation, be that building integrated solar or standalone kind of wind and solar. And yeah, and also thinking about kind of domestic as well as non-domestic. But they have all been projects that have received essentially funding to support them to develop, essentially it's development finance, supporting the kind of establishment of pipelines of projects, and supporting the appointment of a kind of expert team that undertakes that analysis, and over a multi-year program has targets to bring a certain number of projects to financial close. And some of the projects, they're all in different local authority areas, but some of them might eventually be owned, the assets might eventually be owned by the local government. In other cases, the procurement route was that they went out to tender for the private sector to ultimately invest. But yeah, I found that those programs have been really effective at driving kind of building up pipelines within local areas, and also helping to facilitate kind of collaboration between different cities within a region, and bringing together a kind of dedicated team of people that really are very focused on, achieving actual implementation of activities. We also do work. We run a program for Welsh Government called the Welsh Government Energy Service, and this has been running for over 5 years now, I think, in total. And yeah, it's the same kind of principle. It's kind of a large team of people driving forward lots of projects and implementing that, and I think that's something that I'd really love to see more funding to support more and more cities to kind of use that model to really drive the implementation. I think that's been very effective.
Thank you, Emma. Fantastic. Well, we've reached the top of the hour, and I'm confident if we could hear our audience, we'd be listening to a standing ovation. You've been fantastic. I'd like to thank the panel and ASITE, our lead tech partner, and we will be publishing a recording and written summary of this on our website online. Please take a few moments to put down your thoughts about how it went today. You can book future webinars and see all previous recordings also at the website rics.org/WBEF webinars. Follow us on social media, and of course, please do download our app from the web store. So we've been over by a minute, so we'll end it there, but thank you all. Thank the panelists, and thank you all for attending. Thank you.